A lot of listeners hear us talk about why we think decentralization is important and why it's a
Yeah,
core key value of the Web3 and crypto movement. But especially
yeah,
as it pertains to AI, what do you think is the risk of these centralized players like a Microsoft or a Google or an OpenAI dominating the industry? Like what you are pouring your life force into the work of decentralized AI. Like why?
yeah. So I think it's a couple things, right? And I typically don't lean into selling fear, right? Because I think fear it's an interesting motivator, but ultimately it doesn't bring the best out in people, right? And so I think today's narrative, you often hear that centralized AI is this terrible, horrible thing, and it's going to be for companies that rule the world. I think there are layers and elements of truth to that are important to be wary of. But I would also push us to recognize that perhaps Meta and Microsoft have done more for open source AI than perhaps some true open source companies, right? With what Meta has done on the Llama side and Microsoft essentially putting out VS Code, which is arguably like the de facto developer platform across the world, right? Completely free and open source. And so I think there's one end of the spectrum there. The other end of the spectrum, to I think probably the core of your question is, well, if these companies are accruing an incredible amount of value, right? OpenAI does, it was a study released by the information. They do 225 million in MRR, which is like 3.4 billion in ARR. So they're doing okay. And then
That's
obviously
monthly revenue, recurring revenue, and then annual recurring revenue.
this is me falling into the trap of using acronyms.
No
Yes,
worries.
monthly and annual recurring revenue.
So 3.4 billion in annual recurring revenue.
OpenAI, yes,
Hmm.
and then you add in Meta and perhaps those that are consider like the Magnificent Seven or the top performing kind of public companies right now, NVIDIA's of the world, where their market capitalization, or in other words, like the total value of that company is bigger than crypto as a whole. So now you're putting serious dollars and the incentives of serious dollars, which are to continue to make that economic flywheel go at making these models better. Well, how do you actually make these models better? You need individuals' data, right? Because what we've come to at this point is that pretty much the entire internet has been scraped already and used to get what we know as GPT-4, right? And even Llama 3 was about 15 trillion tokens, which is, a good chunk of the entire internet. In order to actually continue to advance AI, you need what is not necessarily publicly available. That's like your private data. That is essentially one of the only ways we're going to continue to advance models, right? That's one path. There's a lot of paths we can talk about, but that is kind of one key path, right? And that's why a lot of these big companies are targeting enterprise use cases, because that's the largest repository of private data. They live in enterprises, right? Then that helps inform the model and it gets better over time. And so
Hmm.
I bring this up to just share context, because if the incentive is for an OpenAI, is for a Google, is for an Anthropic to continue to grow their economic flywheel, they're going to do essentially whatever is necessary to return value to their shareholders and continue to grow the value of that company, which likely means finding ways to gain access to our private data, which likely means those companies kind of deciding how those models are trained, which also likely means us as consumers probably accepting the output of those models as truth, right? Because I think one of the challenges is these models are getting to a point where the outputs are at such high quality that it's hard to understand, well, what is true and what is not. And if that is not essentially baked into your thought processes as you engage with AI, that could become quite dangerous over time, right? In terms of misinformation and disinformation as one bucket. And then the other bucket is, I think, probably to the core of your question, is now we're living in a world where we have essentially a handful of entities and very, very small amount of people, perhaps the 1%, determining what truth might be for the 99%, right? Which kind of tips the scales in a way that we may not want to see. And so that is where, since a lot of our motivation comes from, is how do we actually create that in a more equitable way, right? That is not overly reliant on these kind of massive companies and massive systems. Well, that means we need to build a reputable and an alternative system that is actually at parity in terms of quality, but open, but private, but verifiable, right? Like some of these core pillars that you may hear around decentralized AI, and we can totally dig into that. But these are kind of when we're really digging into the meat of the problem and like the why around this. That is essentially at its core.